Yeah, I mean, I think I love that you called it a word calculator because that's what I've called it in the past as well.
I listened to one of your previous interviews, and so I'm lifting that from you.
Really generous of you, thanks.
For those who are uninitiated, how do you explain prompt engineering at a party?
At a party, um, I think,
Just a regular old party conversation, prompt
yeah,
engineering comes up. What do you say?
yeah, for sure. I mean, now that I'm living in Japan, I usually have to explain it in Japanese. I think in English,
Sure.
the way that I tend to try and approach it is thinking of it's like you're giving instructions to an intern. So think of somebody who's totally new to your organization. They don't really know how the organization works or very much about, what's going on the other side, who your client is, maybe even how the business works. And so setting that context and setting that intern up for success includes things like telling them, "Hey, so this is the person that you are producing content for. This is what they care about. These are what their needs are. And this is the objective we want that content to fill. And oh, by the way, here's how we operate in the space. This is what we represent. These are the kinds of guidelines we have around what you can and cannot say around our brand. Given all those things, I want you to create a very specific output." That's generally how I approach prompt engineering. That's how I kind of explain it to folks. As I say, it's like you're trying to tell someone how to do what you want it to do. And I think an intern in general tends to be a pretty good metaphor in the sense that, they're fresh to corporate and to the organization, perhaps. And I think that's really where it starts to click for a lot of people.
And they're not uninformed, they're not
Yes.
uneducated, but maybe they're a bit naive to the norms of the institution and things like that. So they need a bit more handholding and guidance than somebody who is initiated, somebody who's been there for a few years and kind of knows what's up and knows how who knows the expectations,
Right. I think
right?
it has a lot to do with the awareness of the context. So for example, large language models, I mean, they have access to the whole internet. So it's not like a large language model is inherently deficient in information, but that there's so much information. And so the objective is to guide the large language model into understanding how to use that information. And I think that's sort of what I think when it
Mm.
comes to an intern is it's like you've got this raw potential in front of you. Now, how do you aim that potential and show them how to direct it? So that way they can execute according to the objectives that you set. And a lot of that has to do with making your objectives extremely clear because they are new. And assuming that an intern or a large language model understands the context or the assumptions that you have in your mind, I think are what leads to a less than ideal output.
So there's an article that I'm going to come back to later in our conversation by Jakob Nielsen, who's a famous UI UX person in our space who we all know and love. But there's a great quote from this article where he says prompt engineers exist to tickle ChatGPT in the right spot so it coughs up the right results, which is something that at our agency we've been laughing about that quote for a
Yep.
while now. And what something that I've heard a lot about, especially over the last year, is people sharing advice and tips and tricks on how do you make a successful
Mm.
prompt? Like how do you tickle, the GPT in the right way to get the right thing? And I've heard all kinds of things and all kinds of conflicting advice.
Mm.
Some people say, well, there's sort of like a minimum word count that you want to shoot for,
Oh,
and then other people say there's no such thing. That's ridiculous. That
yeah.
it shouldn't matter. It's about the quality, not the quantity. And of course, well, that sort of makes sense too. And then people have been throwing these other things in there, like, well, at the end, say try your best or start with adopt a persona like you are
Mm.
Steve Jobs, and then
Sure.
here's the prompt, right? Or one that I particularly like is at the end, if you do a good job, I'll tip you. So
Wow. Yeah.
I right. So there, but there's sort of a weird logic to that though,
Hmm.
where if you go back to exactly what you said, which is you have this intern in front of you, right?
Hmm.
And if you put them in the headspace of like, well, if you were Steve Jobs, what would you do? Which I guess is you're this allegedly smart person,
Yeah.
so put yourself in the headspace of an allegedly smart person.
Right.
Or, well, if you do a good job, I'll reward you in some way.
Yeah.
Or you give them some gentle encouragement, like, oh, just try your best, like this is kind of a friendly, just do, ah, shucks, just do the best you can do.
Right.
So is there something to that where there's some kind of a, I don't know, some sort of a weird, because it's a word calculator, right? So is
Yes.
there something
Exactly.
about the I don't know, some kind of weird circular psychology of the word calculator going on there?
Yeah, I mean, I think I love that you called it a word calculator because that's what I've called it in the past as well.
I listened to one of your previous interviews, and so I'm lifting that from you.
Really generous of you, thanks. But that's how I like to think about it because I think people look at it as if it's some sort of crystal ball or some sort of like, omnipresent deity or something like that, when in reality, it's literally just a statistician. It's calculating
Hmm.
what's the next most plausible or probable word in a given sentence based on patterns off of the whole internet. And I think that when it comes to how to sort of change the probability of what's coming next, I don't know that I lean quite as much on psychology. I mean, granted, my academic background is in linguistics, so I'm very biased by that. But I
Hmm.
think that because of my training in linguistics, I've been taught to think of language as a system where there are all these different pieces and parts of how language works. And when you pull on a certain lever or use a certain part, it can create a particular effect. And so I think that rather than trying to sort of, this is where the talking to an intern metaphor starts to degrade a little bit because to an intern, using those psychological, because an intern is very fluent in social practice of language, using those kinds of sort of psychological motivators can be helpful. But in saying, do your best and I'll tip you, I think about it again from the perspective of like management. So if I had a boss who told me, do your best and I'll give you a bonus, but I was totally new to the situation, I would be petrified as an intern because my
True.
immediate reaction would be, I am doing my best. I don't know what else you
Hmm.
want me to do. So I think that kind of goes back to what I was trying to say earlier about, being as clear as possible or as defined as possible about what you want that outcome to look like. Because do your best is a bit of a read my mind. Um, and so when I hear that, like, be like Steve Jobs or do your best, what I hear is that the person who's doing the prompt engineering doesn't actually have as clear of an understanding of what exactly it is that they want in the output. And I think it can be more helpful to try and give very specific examples of how to do that thing that you want to be in the output. If it's a bulleted list, say you want a bulleted list. If you want it to be, short and summarized, then focus on the qualities of the summarization rather than why you want it to be summarized. So, for example, I want the summary to be, you know, I don't know, less than 50 words, and I want it to be in a bulleted list, and I want it to start with action verbs that draw the attention to what the next thing that needs to be done in the list is, and then ending with potentially what that objective is. So that way the reader or the recipient of the content can do X, Y, and Z if that's the ultimate objective. But I think without that degree of sort of description about what exactly it is that you want that content, what purpose you want it to serve, and how you want it to exist, it makes it kind of difficult to be, I guess, to set up the large language model for success. Because it's going to basically do an estimation based on these sort of, the more vague your parameters are, the more creative control or creative liberty it will take. I think that that sounds contradictory in that, again, part of what the advantage of a large language model is the variety that you get in the output. And so trying to constrain that variety can seem counterproductive, but I think it really depends on how you constrain it. So again, like, it's about sort of focusing the direction of that potential. So if you're saying, hey, take a look at the whole internet and make me something good, well, good is different to me than it is to you, than it is to someone in, France, than it is to someone in the United States. I mean, good is highly relative. So if I want it to make something good, then I have to give it the parameters of good and say,
Right.
what I mean by good is I mean that it's succinct. And by succinct, I mean less than 150 characters, because succinct for me may be 2,000 characters, right? Or for you might be 2,000 characters. All of these descriptors can be highly relative. And that's a concept that I learned in linguistics very early on. So I think being as, how do you put this, as precise about what exactly you want it to look like, the output of content, the more satisfied, or the more that you're setting yourself up for satisfaction.
So it sounds like one piece of advice you would have for creating a successful prompt is to be very precise about what your expectations are and what you want. So it's not, in other words, it's not enough to simply say, well, I want a summary of these things. You have to actually define what summary means to you, right? So a summary could
Correct.
be, well, summarize this article. Okay, well, it's going to have to make its best. Again, we're anthropomorphizing
Yes.
this large language model here, but it's going to make its best guess at what a summary means. But maybe, to you, a summary would be 5 bulleted key takeaways. But to me, it's a paragraph
Right.
of no more than 200 words.
Exactly.
And right. Okay, got it. So in other words, then these so-called tricks that people want to play, right?
Yes.
About like, well, adopt this persona, or actually adopting personas that's too broad a thing to say. Saying like, be this smart person, and then try your best, or do it, or be polite, or say thank you and please and things like that in the prompt. Maybe aren't so meaningful, and maybe what's getting muddied here is that in the process of writing a prompt that includes things like, please do this,
Yes.
and try your best, and be like this person, and do this other thing, and do this other thing, you tend to be more verbose in your request. And you tend to, in the construction of your request, start to be more detailed.
Yes.
And then, oh, lo and behold, you're happier with the result.
Right.
It's not because you said, I'll tip you.
Exactly. It's not because you said, I'll tip you.
Yeah, it's because along the way, you started to say more things and be more detailed, and like, oh, hey, look, I like the output more.
Yeah, and I think also thinking through what, again, like you said, like what those objectives are. So if you're saying, be like Steve Jobs, well, Steve Jobs was a lot of things to a lot of people. So are you saying be a father? Are you saying be a husband? Right. Are you saying be a CEO? Are you saying being a manager? Are you saying being a salesperson or an orator? These are all, I think that, again, trying to be a little bit more precise about what exactly you want the LLM to do. If you want it to sell, then say be a salesperson. If you want it to make a strong presentation, then say, okay, be an orator. I think that rather than sort of picking personalities and then having because again, it's about trying to narrow that focus or narrow that scope for the model. So if you're saying, be like Steve Jobs, well, now it has to go and take a look at everything about Steve Jobs on the internet and then make an analysis of who Steve Jobs was as a person across all these different facets, and then come up with an approximation of what qualities of his language would fit the instructions that you've given for the rest of the prompt. So I think, again, trying to get back at that, narrowing the scope, being specific about what exactly it is that you want and what your expectations are. Or if you're writing a prompt to create an output that is on behalf of another person or another audience, then what is that audience expecting, or what do you want that audience to receive, and how do you want them to receive it? Those are the things that I find to be more effective in prompt engineering.
When you're designing prompts for delivering content, how does that differ from delivering prompts for other use cases like performing research or performing an analysis on something? How do you construct those differently?
I think when I hear prompt for content and then prompt for research, I think about the main difference that comes to mind for me is who the audience is. So if I'm creating content, or are you creating a prompt for the sake of creating content, oftentimes I'm thinking of someone who is not me, who is the audience. The person who is going to consume this content is not going to be me, it's going to be someone else. Whereas if it's research, very likely the consumer of that output is me. And so I can be a little bit more selfish in how I prompt it, where I can say, okay, I want these specific things. I want you to do it exactly like this. Whereas if it's content for someone else, like I want you to generate. Actually, I just had a friend ask me this the other day. She was asking me about how to write a prompt to create an Instagram post that would get her more followers. And I'm like, okay, now I have to think about what kind of Instagram account you have and the followers that you're seeking, and then create a prompt that will essentially tell the model, don't create this for me or for her, create it for her audience, or if in a prior roles, I've done prompts where you're creating an email on behalf of someone else. Okay, so who does that person who would theoretically be writing the email sound like? What kind of persona do they have, and who is their audience? In the field of conversation analysis, there's this concept of recipient design, where basically you're thinking very carefully about who is the receiver of whatever it is that you're saying in conversation, and you're going to optimize how you say what you say in order for that receiver to receive it. I think about it very similarly, where we're thinking carefully about how do we want this piece of content to be received by the audience. Who is that audience? What do they care about? And then how do I encode that into the prompt? Well, I got to get really specific. This is who you're talking to. This is what you're doing. This is how I want you to do it. Now do it.